I thought we were celebrating 25 years of marriage over candlelight and good wine. I had no idea that the man sitting across from me, the man who had squeezed my hand in the parking lot and whispered, "You look beautiful tonight, Clara," was about to announce that he was leaving me. What Mark didn't know, what he could not have possibly imagined as he straightened his tie and drew a slow, prepared breath, was that I had been waiting for exactly this moment. I had not come to our anniversary dinner empty-handed. I had come armed. 25 years is a long time. Long enough to build a life so familiar it starts to feel like wallpaper. Always there, always the same, invisible in its constancy. Our house on Millbrook Lane was like that. A wide Victorian with gray siding and white trim, a covered porch where I drank my coffee every morning, surrounded by the smell of cut grass and the sound of birds in the old oak at the edge of the yard. My grandmother had left that house to me when she passed. Not to both of us, not to the couple, but to me, Clara Ann Whitfield, by name, in a will that was precise and deliberate and absolutely unambiguous. I had grown up in those rooms. I had learned to bake in that kitchen, had pressed wildflowers between the pages of encyclopedia volumes in that study, had cried into that porch railing when my father died 2 winters ago. The house was not a piece of real estate. It was the bones of my history, and every nail in every board held something of the woman who had raised me. Mark and I had moved in 6 months after our wedding. I remembered the way the morning light fell through the kitchen window on our first day there, gold and generous, pooling on the worn hardwood floor like something poured from a jar. He had made coffee, and I had stood in the middle of the kitchen in my pajamas and thought, "This is it. This is what happiness looks like." He was 32 then, broad-shouldered and easy with his laughter. He taught high school history and coached the varsity track team. And in those early years, he had an enthusiasm for small pleasures that I adored. Sunday farmers markets, drives with no particular destination, the specific joy of finding a good parking spot in a crowded lot. He was the kind of man who made everything feel manageable. He was the kind of man you trusted without thinking about it, the way you trust a staircase you have climbed 10,000 times. His mother, Eleanor, was another matter entirely. She had never approved of me, though she was careful enough never to say so directly. Eleanor Whitmore was a woman who communicated displeasure through a particular kind of smile, one that stopped precisely at the corners of her mouth and went no further, a thin, polished arc that could mean either warmth or contempt depending on the light. She was 71 now, still formidable in her charcoal wool blazers and pearl earrings, hair the color of pewter swept back from her face with military precision. She lived 40 minutes away in a tidy condo in Hartwell, and in the early years of our marriage, she'd visited infrequently enough that I could manage her with a pleasant smile and a firm internal boundary. We had reached a kind of armistice, Eleanor and I, polite, functional, never exactly warm. But something had shifted in the last 18 months. Since Mark's brother had moved to Seattle and Eleanor had begun speaking more frequently about getting older and the practical realities of life, she had grown more present, more insistent, more deliberate in the way that certain people become when they sense an opportunity narrowing. She appeared at our door on Tuesday afternoons without calling ahead, always with some excuse. A casserole dish she'd left behind, a sweater she'd knitted for Mark, a question about a recipe that could have been answered by telephone. She called Mark's cell phone, not our landline, not the house number, but his cell. And the conversations dropped in volume whenever I walked into the room. She had taken to asking me, with the delicate precision of someone slowly tightening a screw, about the house on Millbrook Lane, about its maintenance costs, about property taxes, about deeds, about whether I had updated the ownership documentation since my grandmother's passing, about whether I had considered that a property of that size was an enormous responsibility for one person to manage alone. I had always answered calmly, pleasantly, the way you speak to a slightly difficult elderly woman whose intentions you would prefer to believe are reasonable. I had mentioned her questions to Mark, and he had sighed in that particular way of his, one hand rubbing the back of his neck, eyes sliding sideways, and said, "She's just practical, Clara. She worries about these things." I had believed him. Or rather, I had chosen to believe him, which is not the same thing at all. The first real tremor came in November, 4 months before the anniversary. We were sitting in the living room on a Sunday evening, Mark with his laptop, me with a book I was not really reading, when his phone buzzed against the coffee table. I watched his jaw tighten, barely perceptibly, the way it does when something catches him unexpectedly. He set the phone face down without answering. 2 days later, he told me he was staying late at school for a curriculum planning meeting. I later discovered, by pure accident, I had thought to email him and pulled up the school's public staff calendar, that no such meeting had been scheduled for that Tuesday. The calendar said otherwise, plainly and without ambiguity. I filed that away. I had become, without fully realizing it, a woman who filed things away. The discovery itself happened on a Wednesday morning, exactly 3 days before our anniversary. Mark had gotten up early to drive to Hartford for a regional educators conference, or so he had said the night before, kissing my cheek as I lay reading, folding his clothes into the overnight bag with a focused efficiency that I had thought nothing of at the time. I came downstairs for coffee, still half asleep, trailing my cardigan, and found his laptop open on the kitchen table. The screen had not yet gone dark. I was not snooping. I want to be clear about that even now because it matters to me. The distinction between looking for something and being confronted with it. I had come downstairs for coffee and nothing more, but the document on the screen was simply there, visible, open. It was a PDF, 3 pages, formatted with the letterhead of a title company I had never heard of, Meridian Property Solutions, and at the top of the first page, in clean, authoritative black type, the words, "Power of Attorney, Transfer of Real Property." My name was in the document. My full legal name, Clara Ann Whitfield, listed as the grantor. The property described with its parcel number and lot dimensions and the address I had lived at for 25 years was my grandmother's house on Millbrook Lane, and the grantee, the recipient of the transfer of power, of my power over my property, was one Eleanor Patricia Whitmore. The signature on the 3rd page was mine, except that I had never signed anything. I stood in my kitchen in the pale gray light of that November morning, and I read the document 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time. My hand stopped trembling somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd reading. The shaking had transmuted into something else, something colder and quieter and far more purposeful. I set my coffee mug down on the counter with such measured precision that it did not make a sound. Then I photographed every page with my phone, closed the laptop exactly as I had found it, and went upstairs to get dressed. I had a phone call to make. His name was David Holt, a property law attorney, the best in Willowbrook County. And he had been recommended to me by my friend Diana 3 years ago for reasons that had, at the time, seemed entirely theoretical. Nothing, it turns out, is ever entirely theoretical. David answered on the third ring, which told me he was already at his desk and the day had begun for him in the productive, deliberate way that it always did. I explained what I had found. I kept my voice level. There was a pause on his end. Not the pause of someone surprised, but the pause of someone rearranging their schedule. "Can you send me photographs of the document?" he asked. "Already in your email," I said. "I sent them from the driveway." Another pause. "Clara, I want you to hear this carefully. Do not mention this to your husband. Do not mention it to anyone. Go about your morning as normally as you can. I'll call you before noon." I drove to the grocery store and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes with the engine running and the heat on, watching the world conduct its ordinary business. A woman loaded bags into her trunk. An old man walked a beagle who seemed deeply dissatisfied with the pace of things. A teenager in a red jacket stood eating something from a paper bag with the concentrated indifference only teenagers can achieve. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. I understood in that parking lot, sitting in my car with my hands in my lap, how completely and systematically a person can be deceived by surfaces. How a life can look entirely intact from the outside while something is hollowing it out from within, patient and precise as water through limestone. David called back at 11:47. His voice had taken on the careful, modulated quality of someone delivering information that is genuinely alarming while working very hard not to alarm you. "The document appears to have been prepared approximately 6 weeks ago," he said. "The signature is a convincing forgery. We'll want a handwriting expert, but my initial assessment is that it's very good. The document was submitted to the county recorder's office 11 days ago." I closed my eyes. Has the transfer been recorded? No, there's a processing backlog. Budget cuts, reduced staff. It's sitting in queue. "Clara." He paused. "That is extraordinarily fortunate. We have a narrow window. If we move today, we can stop this." "What do I need to do?" "We file an emergency injunction to halt the recording. I can have the draft ready by end of day. But I also need you to think carefully about what you want the next steps to look like. What you're describing is real estate fraud, forgery, potentially criminal. Potentially criminal. I turned those words over in my mind like stones in a riverbed, feeling their weight and their particular edges. Eleanor. The pearl earrings and the pewter hair and the smile that never reached her eyes. And Mark. My Mark, who had left his laptop open on the kitchen table before driving to Hartford, leaving behind an open window into a betrayal so deliberate, so methodically constructed that it had been in motion for weeks, perhaps months, while I made dinner and slept beside him and believed, with the stubborn faith of someone who has loved a person for 25 years, that I knew exactly who he was. I drove home. I made dinner. I watched him eat across the table from me that evening, talking about traffic on the I-91 and whether the conference had been worth the drive, and I thought about all the small, ordinary gestures of trust that constitute a shared life. The keys left on the hook, the phone left charging on the nightstand, the back door left unlocked because we had always left it unlocked, because that was the kind of people we were. The kind of couple we had been. The entire architecture of 25 years built on the unexamined assumption that the person on the other side of that life would not willingly take it apart. For 3 days, I was very, very calm. I met with David twice, once in person at his office, where we sat across a polished table with photographs of the forged document between us and spoke in the careful language of people building a legal case, and once by phone on Friday morning when he called to tell me that the injunction had been filed, the recording was formally on hold, and that his assistant had located something else. A second document, a draft partially retrieved through a preservation request, outlining a proposed sale of the Millbrook Lane property to a buyer who turned out, upon investigation, to be a shell company, a company with direct financial connections to a real estate investment group. A group, David said, with a very particular name on its investor list, Eleanor Patricia Whitmore. That was the second blow. The first had been the forged power of attorney. Impulsive, I had still allowed myself to think, even as I photographed it. A desperate measure. The second blow dismantled that interpretation entirely. This was not impulsive. This was not even a plan that had developed over recent months in response to opportunity. This had been conceived and constructed over years. It had contingencies. It had layers. It had, David said quietly, the character of something that had been in development since before my grandmother died, possibly since before she became ill. And Mark. I still did not know, with complete certainty, how much Mark knew. That was the question that hollowed out my chest in the small hours of those 3 nights, lying beside him in the dark, listening to him breathe. His breathing was even and slow, the breathing of a man with a clear conscience, or the breathing of a man who had long since made his peace with what he had done. I could not tell which. I lay in the dark and thought about 25 years and felt something in me go very still, not sad, not angry in the hot, blurring way of immediate pain, something colder, something final, the kind of quiet that comes not from resignation, but from resolution. On Saturday morning, Mark came into the kitchen with a certain studied casualness and announced that he had made a reservation at Renard's for Monday evening, our anniversary. To celebrate, he said, pouring his coffee, not quite meeting my eyes. 25 years. Of course, I said. I smiled at him across the kitchen. My smile, I think, was every bit as carefully constructed as his. David and I spent Saturday afternoon finalizing the last details of what we had come to refer to, with the dark, dry humor of people who have spent too many hours in a crisis, as the plan. On Sunday, I drove to Diana's house and sat in her kitchen and told her everything. She had listened without interrupting, which is a gift. The ability to be still while someone lays out the dimensions of their catastrophe. When I finished, she had reached across the table and held both my hands and looked at me with eyes that were fierce and clear and steady, and she had said simply, "Whatever you need, I am here." It was enough. It was, in that moment, more than enough. By Monday evening, everything was in place. I put on the black dress Mark had always admired, fitted, understated, pearl buttons at the wrist. I did my hair. I applied my lipstick with steady hands and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. And the woman looking back at me did not look like a victim. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was prepared to live with everything that decision would cost. We drove to Renard's in the same car, making the same easy conversation we had made for 25 years. Traffic, weather, whether the restaurant had updated its menu. The October air outside smelled of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. The city lights were coming on as the sky turned dark. It was a beautiful evening, the kind that aches slightly in the chest, that carries within it the sharp, bittersweet quality of something ending. Inside, the maitre d' led us to a corner table by the window. White tablecloth, lit candles, a small arrangement of white roses placed between us like a ceasefire flag. Mark ordered a bottle of Burgundy, a good one, the kind reserved for occasions. When the sommelier had poured and retreated, Mark reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His palm was warm. His hand was familiar to me in the way that only 25 years of small daily contact can make a thing familiar. The width of it, the callus at the base of his thumb, the way his wedding ring sat slightly loose because he had lost weight this past year. 25 years, he said. He was looking at me now, and his expression was something I recognized but had never seen in quite this configuration. Tender and guilty and resolved. The face of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say until the words have worn smooth and the delivery has been perfected. He picked up his wine glass, set it down, picked it up again, and then, quietly, with the gentleness of a man who is quite certain he is being kind, he said it. "Clara, I think we both know this hasn't been working for a long time." His thumb moved in a slow circle on the back of my hand. "I think it's time for us to talk about moving on. I think it's time for me to leave." The candle between us flickered in an almost imperceptible current of air. The restaurant moved around us like a tide. Somewhere behind me, a woman laughed at something bright and easy and belonging to an entirely different kind of evening. I looked at my husband of 25 years, at the familiar planes of his face, at the way his collar sat slightly crooked on the left side the way it always did, and I thought, there it is. And then I reached into my handbag. I placed the envelope on the white tablecloth between us. It was a standard manila envelope, nothing dramatic about it, nothing theatrical, just a plain rectangle of amber paper sitting between the white roses and the wine glasses in the warm pool of candlelight at Renard's on the evening of our 25th anniversary. Mark looked at it the way you look at something your brain has not yet decided how to categorize. His hand was still resting on mine. I let it stay there for just a moment longer, one last deliberate beat, and then I drew my hand away and folded it in my lap. "Before you finish," I said, "I'd like you to open that." His eyes moved from the envelope to my face and back again. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not like in a film, but subtly, the way a light changes when a cloud passes over the sun. The ease drained out of his posture. "Clara, please," I said. My voice was conversational, unhurried. I picked up my wine glass and watched him. He opened the envelope the way people open things they are already afraid of, slowly, with the fingers of one hand, as though the paper itself might be dangerous. He withdrew the pages and unfolded them. I watched his eyes move across the first line. I watched the color leave his face. The first page was a copy of the forged power of attorney, his mother's name, my forged signature, my grandmother's house. The second page was a printout from David's legal filing, the emergency injunction already served, the recording formally suspended. The third page was the partial draft of the property sale agreement to the shell company, with Eleanor's name highlighted in yellow. The fourth page was a signed statement from a forensic handwriting analyst, retained by David's office, confirming that the signature on the power of attorney was not mine. Mark sat very still. The restaurant moved around us. Someone on the far side of the room was celebrating something. I could hear the soft percussion of applause, a ripple of warm laughter. Our table was an island of absolute silence. "I found your laptop open on Wednesday morning," I said. "You left before I came downstairs." I kept my voice entirely even. "I've spent the last 3 days with David Holt. Everything is already filed." His mouth opened, closed. He set the pages down on the tablecloth with the particular care of someone whose hands are not entirely steady. "Clara." His voice had gone rough at the edges. I need you to know I didn't know she was going to do this. I swear to you, I didn't know she had gone that far." "Which part?" I asked. The question was perfectly polite. Which part didn't you know about? The silence that followed was the most honest thing he had said to me in months. I set my wine glass down. "Mark, I need to show you something else." I reached into my bag again and placed a second sheet on the table. A single page, a printout of an email chain, his email address at the top, his mother's email address below, dated 8 weeks ago. 3 exchanges, brief and efficient, discussing the timeline and whether the documentation would hold up to casual inspection. In the third message, Mark's response: "The notary situation is handled. Just make sure the draft sale contract goes through the LLC and not directly to you. Cleaner that way." He read it. I did not look away from his face while he read it. I watched him understand, in real time, that the story he had prepared, the story of the husband who was leaving, who had been coerced or misled, who had simply failed to stop his domineering mother, was no longer available to him. The email had been sitting in a folder he had apparently forgotten to delete in an account I had never had reason to access, discovered by David's legal assistant during an entirely routine document review. When he looked up, his eyes were different. The gentleness was gone. What was there instead was something he had clearly kept very carefully hidden. A flat, assessing look, the look of a man recalibrating. "You went through my email," he said. "Your attorney subpoenaed your records," I said. "Yes." A long pause. The candle flickered again. Outside the restaurant window, the city continued its indifferent business. Headlights sweeping past, pedestrians bent into the October wind, the world entirely unaware of what was quietly coming apart at this table by the window. "She was going to sell the house," Mark said at last. His voice had flattened into something almost businesslike. "She's been trying for years to get access to that property. You know that. You've always known she wanted it. I knew she was interested in it. I didn't know my husband was helping her steal it. It wasn't stealing." He said this with a precision that told me he had rehearsed it, or perhaps simply believed it, and I was not certain which was worse. The house was going to cause problems down the road, estate issues, inheritance complications. "It's my grandmother's house," I said. "It is mine by name, in a will, without ambiguity. There are no estate issues. Clara, you don't understand the financial—" 40%, I said. He stopped. "The shell company," I said. "Meridian's cut was 40%. But the LLC structure traced back to you as a secondary investor, Mark. Not just your mother. You." I paused and let that sit between us in the candlelight. "David found that this morning. He called me on my way here." The silence this time was different, heavier, with a different quality of weight. Mark's jaw moved once, a small, involuntary shift, and I recognized that movement. I had seen it before, in small moments over 25 years, the jaw shift that preceded a lie, a redirect, an explanation that would make everything sound reasonable if you only listened charitably enough. I had spent 25 years listening charitably. "We were going to tell you," he said. "The timing." "Don't," I said quietly. Just the one word. He stopped. I picked up my wine glass a final time and took a slow sip. The Burgundy was good. It really was a good bottle, which struck me briefly as one of the saddest details of the entire evening. All that careful selection in the service of a night that was always going to end this way. "I want to tell you what happens next," I said. not as a threat, as information. I placed the glass down. The injunction is in place and the recording is blocked. The forged document has been reported to the county sheriff's office as evidence of real estate fraud and forgery. David is filing a civil suit against Eleanor tomorrow morning. A criminal referral is possible. He says that will depend on what the DA's office decides to do with the evidence, which has already been delivered to them. I paused. As for the LLC, your name is in the documentation. What the DA does with that is not in my control. Mark had gone entirely still. He was looking at me as though he had never quite seen me before, not with the look of a man discovering something new, but with the look of a man realizing that what he thought he understood was something different than it appeared, a recalibration in reverse. Clara. I also want you to know, I continued in exactly the same tone, that I spoke to your brother in Seattle 2 days ago. He didn't know. I thought you should be aware of that. He did not know. Something moved across Mark's face that was harder to name, something that might have been shame if shame was still available to him. He closed his eyes for a moment. The evening played out after that with the strange, muted quality of a scene that has already been decided. I ate my dinner. It was very good. Roasted duck with a cherry reduction, a seasonal salad with candied walnuts, the kind of meal that reminds you that the world continues to offer small, genuine pleasures even on the worst nights. Mark ate very little. He attempted twice to redirect the conversation. Can we talk about this at home? We don't have to do this here, Clara, please. And each time I simply looked at him without responding, and each time he subsided. Eleanor called while we were waiting for the check. His phone lit up on the table between us, her name across the screen, in the particular bright certainty of someone expecting an answer. We both looked at it. Mark did not pick up. The call rang out and was followed 30 seconds later by a message that was long enough to scroll. He read it. I watched his face. Whatever was in that message, I suspected she had been informed, perhaps by her attorney, perhaps by someone at the county recorder's office who had noted the suspension of the filing. It was not good news for Eleanor's evening either. He put the phone face down on the table. He said nothing. I'm going to need you to make arrangements to stay somewhere else, I said. When we get home tonight, I'd like you to take what you need for the next week. My attorney will be in contact with yours. Clara. His voice had changed again, quieter now, and somewhere beneath the quiet, something that might have been genuine. I'm sorry. I need you to know that I know. I know how wrong this was, all of it. I told myself it would be fine, that we'd work it out, that once it was done, you'd understand. You forged my signature, I said, not angrily, plainly. Or you allowed someone to do it on your behalf. You were selling my grandmother's house out from under me. And then you were going to sit down across from me tonight at our anniversary dinner and tell me you were leaving, which would have made the transfer much simpler, legally. I looked at him steadily. Was that the sequence, Mark? Was that the plan? Leave first, then the house becomes a marital asset in dispute instead of my separate property? The silence confirmed it more completely than any answer could have. That's what I thought, I said. He paid the bill. Of course he paid the bill. We drove home without speaking. The October dark pressed against the car windows, and the familiar streets of our neighborhood scrolled past. The Hendersons' house with its yellow porch light, the old elm on the corner that had lost a large branch in last year's ice storm, the turn onto Millbrook Lane, and then our house, gray with white trim in the wash of the headlights, the covered porch, exactly as I had left it that morning, the light I had left on in the front window still burning steadily against the dark. He packed a bag. He was quiet about it and careful, which I appreciated. He did not attempt another conversation, another apology, another explanation. He took his overnight bag and his laptop case and his good winter coat, and he stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a moment, just stood there, looking at nothing in particular. And then he walked down the stairs and out the front door, and I heard his car start in the driveway and the sound of it diminishing down the street until there was nothing left but silence. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I was still in the black dress. The pearl buttons at my wrists caught the light. I sat there for a while, not crying, not thinking in any particularly organized way, just existing in the specific stillness of a moment after a very long thing has ended. The legal proceedings moved quickly, as these things go when the evidence is thorough and the attorney is competent. Eleanor's criminal referral was accepted by the DA's office, forgery of a real estate document being, as David had explained, a felony in our state, regardless of whether the transfer had been completed. The shell company was dissolved in November, its assets frozen pending investigation. Eleanor's own attorney advised her, in very clear terms, to reach a civil settlement rather than proceed to trial, and she did, relinquishing any claims to the property, paying substantial damages, and receiving, as a formal consequence from the county, a notation in the deed, records that preserve the history of the attempted fraudulent transfer. Her name on those records was permanent. I found, when David told me this, that I did not feel vindictive about it. I felt simply that the record was accurate. That accuracy mattered. Mark's involvement was reviewed by the DA and ultimately not prosecuted criminally. He had been a passive beneficiary of the scheme rather than its architect, David explained, and the evidence of his direct participation, while damning in a civil context, did not meet the threshold for criminal charges. He accepted that without complaint. He had retained his own attorney by then, and our divorce, which was finalized in February, was conducted with a quiet, exhausted efficiency that felt appropriate for the ending of something that had been dying longer than either of us had admitted. He kept his car, his retirement account, and his half of the savings. I kept the house. His brother Thomas called me from Seattle in December. He was a decent man, always had been, and the call was brief and genuine and required nothing from me except to hear it. He said he was sorry. I believed him. By March, the crocuses were coming up along the front walk. I was sitting on the porch the morning they appeared. The first 3 of them, pale purple and resolute, pushing up through the last of the cold earth the way they did every year without fail, as though they had a standing appointment. The coffee in my mug was hot. The air was sharp and clean and smelled of early spring mud and something faintly sweet that I could never quite identify. Some bloom or other, working quietly in the yard. A bird called once from the old oak at the edge of the property, clear and unhurried. Diana came by that afternoon with a bottle of wine and a potted hyacinth in deep violet, which she set on the kitchen windowsill, because she knew I had always kept flowers there, and the windowsill had been empty all winter. We sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light, that same gold, generous light that I remembered from my first morning in this house 25 years ago, and we talked for a long time about nothing in particular, about the crocuses, about her daughter's new apartment in Portland, about a film we had both seen and disagreed about in the comfortable way of people who have argued pleasantly about films for 30 years. Later, after she had gone, I stood at the kitchen window in the last of the light, my hands wrapped around my mug, and I looked out at the backyard, The oak tree, the old wooden fence, the garden bed where my grandmother had grown tomatoes every summer until her hands wouldn't let her anymore. The house was very quiet. It was mine, in a way it had always been, but that I understood differently now. Not as something passive and inherited, but as something I had stood up for, something I had chosen, something I had defended with every resource available to me and won. Some things you only understand the value of when you have come very close to losing them. That is not a comforting thought exactly, but it is a true one. And I had learned, in the past year, that I could live with true things far more easily than I had ever been able to live with comfortable lies. I finished my coffee. I rinsed the mug and set it on the rack. Outside, the oak tree moved in the early spring wind, that same old tree in that same old yard, and the kitchen filled with the last warm light of a Tuesday afternoon, and I stood there in it for a little while, unhurried, thinking about nothing and everything all at once. 25 years, and all the years still left.